Mr. Chair.
Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Chairman. I want to talk to the title of this bill, which is the Climate Change Response Amendment and Other Matters Bill, because the title implies that this bill is a serious attempt to respond to climate change. And I want to say why, in my opinion, the bill shouldn't proceed with that name, because it is a misnomer to suggest that this will do anything meaningful to reduce New Zealand's climate change emissions, which, after all, is the objective of climate change policy. Mr. Chairman, the main response for New Zealand to the challenges posed by our climbing emissions is to price emissions. And that's intended to give an economic encouragement to the people who consume emissions-intensive products like petrol or aluminium or steel, or the people who produce the goods that are consumed by society, to change the mix of goods that we consume in a way that reduces emissions. That's, simply put, what emissions pricing is meant to do. And emissions pricing is an alternative to the other ways that you can reduce emissions, which is to regulate. If you want to do something other than education, the only two ways that you can influence behaviour are either by pricing something to encourage people to change their behaviour, or to regulate by saying thou shalt not do this, or thou shalt do less of this. So in New Zealand, after quite a period of debate that lasted more than one government, National then Labour, we eventually got to the point in New Zealand where Parliament agreed that we should be trying to do our bit in the world, in part through pricing emissions. And it was never going to be the complete answer, but it was always a very important part of the prescription for New Zealand. Now, it worked in New Zealand in two main ways. One, it was discouraging of increases in emissions in emission-intensive goods. And two, it was effectively giving a price benefit to people who reduced emissions, like the forestry sector, because they sequester carbon in the trees that, as they grow, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So, Mr. Speaker, that was the essential intention of the Act. Now, for anyone to influence behaviour by price, the price has to be meaningful. Otherwise, it is a fig leaf and an excuse for inaction that you would take if you weren't doing anything via price. And that's where we've got to in New Zealand now. This is just a fig leaf. This is not having any material effect on behaviour. And we know that because the foresters, who are the biggest potential reducers of greenhouse gases emanating from New Zealand, came to us and said that the price now is so low that it doesn't influence behaviour. It doesn't allow them to overcome the disadvantage that they have because they're facing a land price being paid by, in some areas, the dairy sector, who can afford to pay a higher land price than they can, in part because the dairy sector is protected from having any obligation to account for their agricultural emissions. So the forestry sector say not only is the price really low and not acting as a sufficient incentive to new forests, which are what New Zealand's overly reliant upon in terms of emission reductions, but also they suffer this disadvantage that they're competing for land against a sector that is not facing any cost for their agricultural emissions. And this Act, or this bill, if enacted, puts that inclusion of agriculture on the never-never. It says that under this Act it will never happen, and effectively Parliament would have to come back to legislate again. Now, how does it do that? Well, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Parker, I might have pressed the bell a minute early. My apologies.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman.